Good evening, everyone. I am Amrita, Research Associate at the Institute for Governance, Policies and Politics, New Delhi. I welcome you all to the panel discussion on Securing the Feed, Social Media Strategies to Combat Deepfakes. In an era where AI has made remarkable strides, one facet that has emerged as both intriguing and concerning is the realm of deepfakes. Defined by the digital manipulation of video, audio, and images using AI, deepfakes pose a significant threat as they seamlessly blend into reality, potentially leading to reputation damage, the fabrication of evidence, and an erosion of trust in democratic institutions. Recent incidents, such as the circulation of deepfakes featuring celebrities like Rashmika Mandana and Taylor Swift, have garnered millions of views and raised serious concerns about the potential misuse of this technology. The swift action taken by social media platforms like X, formerly Twitter, to remove Taylor Swift's deepfakes underscores their ability to react promptly when a high-profile figure is affected. However, this prompts a very vital question. If such responsiveness is possible for celebrities, can we not expect the same urgency when the privacy and well-being of a common individual is at stake? Before we begin this discussion, I would like to introduce the panelists. Ms. Maya Sherman. Ms. Maya Sherman is an experienced AI policy researcher, ethicist, author, and social innovation practitioner. She is an AI expert and project co-lead in the Future of Work Committee of Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence, and advisory board member in tech communities for youth in the USA and Asia. She works as an AI consultant at the American Indian Foundation, providing strategic advisory on AI policies and digital transformation in waste management services across India. Mr. Aman Taneja is Principal Associate and Lead Emerging Technologies at Ikigai Law. He is an experienced IP, technology, and disputes lawyer. Issues of online content regulation, intermediary liability, and AI regulation are key areas of focus for him. The session will be moderated by Dr. Manish Tiwari, co-founder, Ranga Social Media and Tech, and Director, IGP. I now hand over the discussion to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Amrita. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you both of you to take time out from your schedules and get onto this discussion. I take this opportunity to bring the pressing issue of deepfake content involving common users today for the discussion. We have seen that in the case of Taylor Swift, X has very swiftly removed the content. We just want to discuss whether it is possible for an average user, particularly in such cases of deepfake. Is it possible for the common users to appeal to these companies or the companies to really have the kind of mechanism which we are expecting that they should be having for a common user? I want to come to you, Mr. Aman, first. Do you think that the issue of deepfake is really a kind of issue which should be ideally on one of the biggest issues on the tech policy landscape?
Sure. Thanks for the question. Thanks for having me here. I'll maybe before getting into whether deep fakes by themselves are the biggest issue in the tech policy landscape, if we zoom back a little, and a lot of this conversation tends to be about the role of platforms and the harms that are occurring. I think if we zoom out for a second, one big reason a lot of this is possible today, and I don't mean to just flag the harms, right? But a lot of the good that has happened in the last 20, 30 odd years is because of the democratization of information fundamentally, right? Like platforms have now come in and given voice to people. User-generated content is what a lot of us consume, rely on. It's had a lot of good in the world, and yes, as as we are progressing, we are also starting to see the harms. But I think it is important to frame it in that context of what the internet has fundamentally done for information itself, right? Like there is much more of it than there's ever been before. And I think it's hard to argue that outcome itself is not a good outcome for us at sort of society scale. Coming to the question on deepfakes, and I like to think of deepfakes as actually a subset of the larger issue being of misinformation, disinformation, right? And balancing that in the free speech context. Let's because those are the tensions at play. The fact that everyone has been given a voice and is able to communicate and is able to put their views out there is the free speech aspect here. There is much good that has come from there. At the same time, the challenges of misinformation and disinformation are real and are probably one of, I do believe the most important questions for society to answer at this point, right? Like, how do we, are we really living in a post-truth era, as was put a few years ago? So certainly, and I don't think deepfakes by themselves are the only issue. It is the larger ecosystem of information, of misinformation, disinformation that we're looking at. But certainly, it is going to be a challenge going forward, and we do need to think through solutions also at a society level scale. I don't think this is a problem for one or two people to solve. So I'll maybe pause there, and I do know you have more questions, but I can dive a little deeper into what I mean by society level sort of solutions to some of this.
I want to come to you, Ms. Maya, with a similar question, not exactly same, like, that the issue has been prevalent as Aman has just also described, like it's a subset of the larger problem. And the larger problem is about, the significant threat we have in form of misinformation, disinformation in the society. And which is like, getting spreaded more or faster through internet. Now, that is one. I just want to know, like, particularly from the perspective of women and children, how do you think, how significant is this problem or how large is it?
Many thanks for the question. And of course, I'll also address the insightful remarks of Aman as well. I would say that deepfake is, again, it's not an independent problem. It's a consortium of different aspects of what we would say are, again, online falsehoods, and there are different forms. So when we're speaking about deepfake, it's definitely an escalation. And I would say that the interesting part of it, it's the fact that it takes probably our more basic human senses of seeing an evidence, of listening to it, and all of a sudden we cannot even evaluate if something is true or false. And this is, I would say, a more philosophical concern that definitely should be addressed, because we're also defining and redefining how humans are supposed to interact with technologies, how we're supposed to think. So I would say this is the biggest threat of deepfake, that it's in many ways undermines our abilities to perceive our environment, to perceive the way we interact with people, and to consume news. So there are, of course, a lot of benefits, as I mentioned, of the information ecosystem, and I'm one of the biggest proponents. I do support AI for good, and I think that also deepfake actually has some very positive outputs that we can delve a bit more afterwards when it comes to reimagining of human livelihoods in a more positive way, especially for more problematic scenarios. But when we are thinking of marginalized communities, I think that becomes the bigger threat. We are seeing a lot of news about the way that, I would say also in Bollywood, we're seeing a lot of instances of deepfake videos being released in the last, I would say, 2 years, and recently a bit more with the release of new movies, and then some of the ad-hoc policies. And of course, with Taylor Swift, that's got a very instant reaction from Twitter that raised a lot of questions. But the impact is, of course, on the average users, but particularly on women. We're discussing about non-voluntary pornography that still represents, I would say, still has a very strong gender affiliation when it comes to deepfake. We just, I would say, pretty recently, we've had a few very, I would say, alarming instances of women in Pakistan that were killed due to deepfake videos. Because again, in some more conservative settings, deepfake can actually have a much more lethal outcome. And when it comes to youth, we are speaking about bullying, the ability to perhaps again harm those that are much more vulnerable and do not have the same scrutiny that bigger celebrities do have when it comes to the platforms. I think that the question that will also be interesting to discuss is whether we want the platforms to be the one responsible. Do we actually require from them to be the one who are setting the right guidelines? Or that at this point, if we want to see the average users being more protected, then it's time for policymakers to take a more dominant role in also setting the ground for the platforms rather than the platforms designing the rules of the game, which in my view, what has happened till now due to some, I would say, operational vacuums. But yeah, so this is briefly, I'll be glad to delve into any of these points.
I think what you have mentioned about policymakers and how it's like platforms would bring some solutions, but we have to talk about a legal framework. And when we talk about it, I just want to delve into a little legal framework question. And if you look at the India's IT Act and maybe global policies of EU, UK, Canada, China, we have different kind of solutions different countries or different regions are bringing. China have they've introduced some of these things, but many other countries, but still we find a kind of a legal vacuum. And I'm talking in more terms of the we sitting in India particularly. And Mr. Aman, do you think the governments can really have a can bring some regulation to this thing, which is not so bound by the rule of the land? Do you think from a legal perspective, is it really possible to bind the companies or the social media platforms to conform to whatever we decide?
So, no, happy to take that question. I think one very important and that tends to be the framing in these conversations is that what should governments tell platforms to do, right? And it's the easiest in some sense because that's your major platform for dissemination of a lot of deepfake content is to go after the platform. But if we take a step back, let's look at what are the different stakeholders in the ecosystem itself, right? And then we start thinking about what needs regulation, what requires maybe other forms of policy intervention. So if you kind of zoom out for a second, if you see where this starts from, there are certain tools which are out there which allow you to make realistic deepfake content. I'm not going into definitions of what deepfakes are, etc. Let's understand the problem is it's always been possible for someone to come and manipulate media. What deepfake tools have done is make that a lot easier, right? That's why it's kind of a step up. But so one is the tools themselves which enable the creation of this kind of synthetic content. That's number one. So the tools are one stakeholder. Then you have the people who are using these tools, the creators of the manipulated media, the synthetic media. And again, it could be used, it's very often used in movies, it's used in advertisement, it's used by people to do satire. There are many positive uses that creators are putting this technology to, right? Even in the context of, say, election campaigns, people are able to use these tools to drive messaging in multiple languages, engage with voters. I mean, and it's stuff political parties have also done in the country, and as in pursuit of what they see as a legitimate use of the tools. So but then at the same time, they are the creators who are actively with intention trying to cause harm, right? The third player in this ecosystem, I would say, are the methods of dissemination. And now this includes of course, your large social media platforms, but also traditional forms of media, right? Where if editorial checks aren't strict enough, you might see deepfake content coming out as being published. So let's look at these as the platforms of dissemination. Even within those, there's more than one category. We can think of them as the social media platforms which put out, give a platform for user content, and you have people publishing sort of first party content, blogs, newspapers, etc. And the last category, I would say, in terms of stakeholder, I mean, maybe not the last, but then there's I think Maya also made that point about impact on sort of the average user, all of us who are both consumers of this, and potentially victims of some sort of targeted, content being made about us. So that's one band. And then there is the role of government in all of this, right? Like as the regulator, as this norm setter, in whatever shape or form. So there are at least 5 different stakeholders that I've identified here, and there could be more. There could be more in in each of these different chains. But if we were to zoom out, I don't think solutions to this problem will be found only at going at the platforms. Certainly, platforms will have to do more, be more accountable to users of their platforms. Absolutely, no doubt about that. But I don't think regulations will also work if they're only targeted at one place, right? So, for instance, having regulations in place for the tools themselves, in terms of, and this is kind of what some jurisdictions have tried doing, right? Like mandatory watermarking obligations, to ensure that any synthetic content it becomes clearer to people that this is synthetic. At the creator stage, of course, if you are the person indulging in the actual harmful content with intention, a lot of that, the consequence for the wrong should really fall on the person who is doing this. Platforms for dissemination are one, and I think we'll spend a little bit more time talking about what their obligations are, etc. But I think one fundamental question also becomes: do we want platforms to be making determinations of what is fake, what is not, in all circumstances? I think there needs to be some amount of gradation there. You might need to respond quicker in high risk situations, and I think there's general consensus globally on certain things are higher risk. Terrorism content about intimate sexual imagery, whether permissible or not. I mean, child sexual abuse material. Those are the highest risks that we can see. But when it comes to, say, satire, political speech, do we want platforms to be the ones making those decisions to retain safe harbor? I don't think that's a great society level outcome either. Then also on then kind of the everyday user, right? I think what we and I mean, speaking for other people here, but what we really need is that ability to be able to distinguish between what is real and what is not, what is manipulated, what is not. And there are various methods to arrive at that. I think some of it is fundamental, and also how to behave on the internet itself, right? Like, I think the fact that people, and as this arm user who ends up becoming a creator of, in the case of Taylor Swift or anyone else, someone felt that it was okay to do this. Until we educate people into realizing that this is not acceptable behavior, these problems will continue. Third, and of course, the ability to distinguish between, and I think what misinformation, disinformation, and the deepfake conversation does is also realize that it's a two-part problem, right? Like, you can solve it either by making people sure that something is authentic. So there are initiatives around content authenticity. So you realize that there are certain trusted sources of information and you rely on those more, and everything else you take with a pinch of salt. You are a little skeptical about, just because and that, I think that's the point Maya was also making about, it's in terms of human psychology also. When you look at something, hear it feels very real, and that's maybe the risk with deepfakes, but maybe we also need to be better educated in understanding where that line is. So I think it needs solutions. Any solutioning will have to be at a few levels, and if we keep the focus only on platforms, then we are only solving one part of the problem and ignoring all the other players in the ecosystem, and also then your policy responses are also then very narrow and focused on only just one set of players and not necessarily others. So that's
yeah, but my major, we have talked about platforms and we are talking about people being responsible to understand and all. But my thing is like, it's like human society has been so. And the human society has been so for ages. And that is why we have the evolution of law and different rules and regulations. I'm just asking, like, because it's a new area, because the whole virtual space is a new space for us. How do you think that, the governments or the regulations are necessary for platforms? What kind of necessity you see around? Ms. Maya, would you like to answer that? Like, do you want the governments to be responsible? Do you want the regulations to be stringent? What do you want?
No, definitely. Thank you for the question. I will say, especially after seeing the pretty long evolution of the AI Act and the recent approvals, which really was a happy moment, I think, for many AI researchers out there. I believe it shows that if we're not taking regulation in a more granular and a more contextual level, it will be incredibly hard to create the ideal regulation. And my point is that I believe that at this point, yeah, there will be different phases for solution. It needs to include digital literacy. It needs to include the platform. But I would say that the engine that needs to start it and kind of fill in the void that we are seeing, which is the fact that we don't have clear regulation against deepfake, is to have, I would say, a more nuanced regulation addressing certain case studies. The cross-cultural variance in terms of delivery, in terms of content moderation is immense. There have been studies about this. We have seen the impact of lack of linguistic moderation in Meta over the past. We've seen this in different countries. We've seen this in Brazil. We've seen this in Myanmar. The point here, and that's what I believe will be also the delivery challenge of the AI Act in many ways, is the fact that it still creates pretty I wouldn't say generic, but pretty broad categories of what's prohibited and what's allowed, without going into the cultural granularity, a bit more rigorous understanding of the delivery. So I would say that I hope to see future regulations addressing deepfake mitigation and moderation across case studies, and we've seen this over the past, especially coming from tech companies that trying to see what's supposed to happen in different case studies, but also from government initiatives trying to promote a more accurate understanding of where deepfake is beneficial and when it's not. That I would say as well, to kind of incentivize the other phases of the solutions, I do expect regulation to give some guidelines and baselines for the soft skills. We do need to see some routes for digital skills and literacy as part of the regulation. Addressing only why deepfake is bad and when it's allowed will not necessarily advance us when digital literacy is not mandatory. And I think that's perhaps a shift in mind that I would advise, that understanding the digital literacy cannot be an added value. In an era that deepfake can actually be harmful and lethal for certain populations, it can be weaponized. So digital literacy should be looked upon, what I would say, as a regulatory asset. It should be also legislated in a way, maybe again not restricted in a certain manner, but still it needs to be represented, because of course going forward, the solution to such phenomena is a long-term process. There'll be deviations, there'll be a lot of learnings and tactics across countries, but I would say that current regulations just do not represent it. And I think that country as a nation, realizing the sociocultural complexity it's still a process that I would say it would be very interesting to see what would the Indian regulation look like, in a form that is still enabling innovation and social innovation and not censoring anyone, but in the same time moderating the harms. So if I sum up my ideas, I would say that I hope to see contextual based regulation, much more discussion about prohibition of deepfakes according to case studies across different regions, and hopefully some regulatory grounds for digital literacy that will make it almost mandatory in certain instances.
I think it brings us, the discussion till now brings us for two sides. One is on the regulatory side from the governments, and second is on the side of the platforms. Because it is a responsibility, whose responsibility it is actually. Because platforms are, after all, a business. And if it's a good business proposition, it makes you good business, I would pay for it. We have seen recently in case of Meta, after this hearing in the US Senate, they have there was some news about recruiting 100 people who would be moderating the content and those kind of things. So if it is a good business model, we are making good money, we would do it. But if you are not making it, and still it is harmful. As you have said, what kind of there are smaller platforms or there are more tools which are making, which are used for making those deep fakes. What is the, who does, with whom it lies the responsibility? Where do you want to see it? Like from a legal perspective and from the perspective of society, where do you want to see the responsibility lie? We could have a good regulation which can force companies, or we could have companies self-regulate. What exactly should be the way out? Any one of you can answer it first.
I would say, in my eyes, the question of who is accountable and who is the one to lead has hindered the regulatory process in many ways. I feel, and I hope at least, that we'll be able to see a more collaborative approach. I do not think that deepfake should be tackled from a top-down policy approach of regulators coming and dictating the way. I think that we should also see the platform's involvement in shaping the design. I think that if we're thinking of previous initiatives, especially, I would say Meta's labs have tried to do this kind of industry ecosystems coming together and doing policy prototypes of how certain regulations are supposed to impact. And this kind of initiative, I think that's the other way to go forward. Now, Meta, of course, has its quite questionable reputation when it comes to content moderation, but I would still appreciate the fact that there is an understanding that under this regulatory scale of policymakers dictating the policy, the government, the regulation, and then we're able to test a bit more the reactions, and the platforms kind of giving their own interpretation. We need to see how the users should be involved as well in the regulatory process. How can they give their feedback? So I would ideally be much more hopeful to see initiatives of policy prototyping enabling this discussions on regulations rather than saying one entity being responsible. Also, I would say in terms of the literature, there have been kind of mixed opinions on who is the one who's supposed to lead this kind of initiative on tackling disinformation, misinformation, and now as we're seeing the 3.0 generation of deepfake and going forward. So I hope to see more discussions on regulation that involve the governments, the platforms, and the users, understanding that each has a role in the value chain. Each will be impacted differently. So I hope that, again, we'll be able to reach into a much more hybrid essence of how deepfake regulation is being established, and still acknowledging the role of each entity in this process. I think that we're already kind of bleeding there because it's becoming kind of a ping pong between platforms trying to set the rules of the game so they won't be harmed and fined so much, and the government that we're kind of lagging behind in a way, but are trying to step up because regulation takes time. And the users that are found in I would say, an operational void, leading to the fact that we're seeing much more deepfake videos. And of course, ChatGPT also increased people's awareness to the fact that technology can do wonders once you're able to access the internet. But that's exactly the place that I hope to see much more collaborative discussions on how regulation can be co-created. It's time to see much more public-private partnerships, and also to see how the citizen can be part of the discussion. In Europe, there have been a lot of attempts to create again, especially with the conference on the future of Europe, that citizens can actually vote and decide on certain parliamentary issues, translated in all the languages, out of a similar standpoint. Of course, it's not as controversial as deepfake, but it might be time to start discussing how to create these regulatory platforms that convene as many players as possible to discuss what would regulation look like and how all entities understand their roles and are not harmed in a way. That's my input to that, and I look forward to hearing that. Yours, Aman.
What do you think of it, Aman?
No, I couldn't agree more with some of what Maya just said. It is certainly, I mean, one kind of way to look at it also is, for very long, at least in India, a lot of the regulation on the internet has been happening in a fairly knee-jerk manner, right? Like one incident happens and then we very quickly start thinking about what do we need to do to fix this one issue, which one leaves you blind to a lot of things around. Two, it's because it is so knee-jerk, like you're not taking people along with you in quite the same way, right? So I really echo what Maya was saying in coming up with interesting ways to have a lot more collaborative approaches to this. I do agree that it can't be left up to one stakeholder only. It cannot be coming top down from the government or platforms shaping policies unilaterally. I think it does require a lot more. To enable that, also we do need, and I think the EU Act has done some of this in terms of giving access to information to researchers and scholars as well, right? Like that's so critical, because today we're having this conversation on deepfakes, and you give the example of our common everyday users given the same level of protection as, but do we actually have a body of literature to support where the gaps are? Or are we just hypothesizing this without really knowing where the problem is? What is the site of the problem? What are the bigger problems that we want to tackle first? So in the absence of evidence, we're not really going to be able to do any evidence-based policy making either, right? Like we really do need to focus our attention. And again, a lot of this is trying to, this is a lot has happened in the last 20 odd years with social media coming about, etc. And we as society are trying to kind of fix airplane while the engine is burning midair. Like it does feel like that, right? We don't have the luxury of landing, taking a step back, getting everyone safely out, and then trying to fix the problems. We don't have that luxury. So it is important that one, we take everyone along with us, but also do it in a way that understands where the gaps really are. And what I think it's also incredibly important to be aware of the risks of over-regulating in this space can also be, right? If there is too much pressure put on platforms to a certain line or to take down content very quickly, it does have an impact on free speech as we know it. It also, and there's interesting research around this on the liar's dividend, right? Like if I'm able to turn around and call anything fake, then the incentives are getting extremely skewed. If every time someone gets up and says fake news and you have to take it down, or deep fake and you have to take it down, then it becomes a means of kind of purging real information out there as well. So there is a real risk in our regulatory response if it's not calibrated and thought through, we might end up doing way more harm than good as well. I mean, that's a possibility that exists. So I do echo a lot of what Maya said in terms of bringing people along and having all stakeholder voices and aware stakeholders. So I think it's also important to understand and we could talk a little bit more about that, but in terms of what the limitations in terms of moderation, etc., are like there's platforms are good at some kinds, not so good at other kinds. Context is very often important. In the absence of that, what do you do? So these aren't easy problems, and I don't think you can have like a okay, today a problem is cropped up, let's solve it tomorrow, let's bring in a regulation. If we keep going down that route, we're not going to actually come up with solutions which are lasting.
Let me come to kind of conclude this thing with a simple question. It has happened in case of Taylor Swift. If it happens to a common girl in Delhi tomorrow, can she approach the platform? Would platform do it for her? Is there a regulation from the government which compels them? Aman.
Sure. I mean, I don't see a reason why not. This a sort of manipulated content of this nature very much against, I think, community guidelines of all platforms, right? So if it gets reported, and again, this becomes one of those challenges, right? Like whose job is it to report, etc. But I don't see, and I'm happy to be told that I'm wrong about this, but the tools do exist, right? The reporting mechanisms exist. The policies are there. The law, in fact, in certain situations, the IT rules itself, in the case of, say, non-consensual sexual imagery, put a much higher burden, a much quicker turnaround time is expected of platforms. Like if it's reported, you take it down, and then I mean your response times are also much quicker in those sort of circumstances. So it's not as though the tools aren't there within the platforms itself. The other thing is, it's not as though laws don't exist to try and go after the perpetrators, right? I think there was a question asked in Parliament about deepfakes itself, and the IT ministry itself responded saying, this could be, say, punishable under Section 469 of the Indian Penal Code, which is forgery with the intent to harm someone's reputation, for instance, right? And which is what this would be. But who has done it? That at the end of the day, it's someone who's used the tool and done it. Like, so that person is the one who needs to be persecuted, and you can't just hold one party here responsible. Like the platform is sure a means of dissemination. They have tools to take things down. They'll do it when asked to. As long as the other requirements of the law are being met, I don't see why not. And that's why I also said, is there evidence to the contrary of users not being able to access those sort of redressals? I'd love to know if there's more, because then we know what the problem is that we're trying to fix, right?
Do you want to answer that, Maya? What is your research and what is your observation suggesting?
I would say that from the US perspective, I think that there have been, I would say, quite significant evidence. We've never seen such a quick policy turnover when it comes from a regular user. So we are clearly seeing some content moderation obstacles. I would say even in the Indian context, so I got to explore a bit more deepfake in Bollywood and the intersectionality. We have seen, I would say that any declarations on policy changes came from, I would say, quite specific instances. But it is never, again, there have been a lot of publications on deepfake videos recently, but most of them came after it's been someone slightly more known or an influencer that has some power. And I think that more study should be into this in terms of what evidence is required to show certain fallacies and response time. But still, I would say that today the fact that only certain instances of deepfake do receive this policy scrutiny and policy modification is an alarming sign. The question is, of course, who would like to research this kind of policy loopholes and enforcement loopholes? And I think that all of them indicate that we need to move perhaps a bit more from the conception of establishing just policies alone, and also to understanding how the enforcement mechanisms are supposed to look like. And I think that's where there is perhaps too much of a variance. There, to my understanding and from what I've researched in the past, there have been various ways to create content moderation and in different geographies, also to allow this flexibility. There is still, I would say, a gap when it comes to user reporting. Sometimes in case of users being afraid of reporting and not wanting to reveal. And I think that's a gap that should be addressed more, how we are incentivizing victims to speak up more and give them a safer space to report. But in some cases, the fact that the content moderators as well, some of them comprise out of human and some of them out of automated tools. So automated tools, of course, have their own loopholes. So the response time is not always as high. And in many cases, especially in times of conflict or more controversial times, the output sometimes can, again, it's vague, it's ambiguous, and some users will not exactly receive the kind of support or protection that they require. So I think that all of this, and of course I'll be glad to hear for your inputs, but I would say that it clearly shows the lack of policy enforcement in a way, but also the fact that policy enforcement is still not as sensitive to the user on the individual level. I don't think the platforms are the ones who can actually lead to this, and I think that's exactly the places that government, citizens, and platforms should collaborate, because the ones who can actually teach what's sensitive, what's the right framework that should be used, I believe it should come from the users. So that's my input to this. So if we would be able to create this kind of more sophisticated user feedback that will be properly evaluated and with enough cultural sensitivity, I think we'll be in a different place. But I do echo with Aman. There is not enough evidence about this. Whatever I got to see is still sporadic. It's more related to certain think tanks would like to show a certain agenda about this. So I do hope that there will be more study into why certain user cases do not get enough scrutiny, and if that's the case across geographies.
Aman, would you like to bring in your last word on it in terms of the question, the answer to the question which we are really seeking, if it is possible for a common user?
I mean, is it possible for the common users? I think yes, the policies are there now. As Maya also, I think, just made the point on whether the policies are enforced, etc. I think the other challenge is also, so reporting on platforms is kind of one part of the problem, right? There are criminal provisions at play where, and I think the point Maya made is, critical to important. Also, the culture and what role we all have to play is, would you ever want to go into a police station with a complaint about this? Like, just given how challenging that becomes and the sort of questions you might be exposed to, that the fact that the process and procedure itself might be a bigger punishment than anything else is something that we need to urgently tackle as well, right? Like, otherwise, the entire framework of law enforcement, that entire mechanism that you have there one is, of course, on the reporting on platforms, and that ability exists. There is now, even within the IT rules, if your grievances are not addressed within a certain amount of time or addressed properly, you have the ability to appeal some of those. So those mechanisms have been built into the rules. And again, one thing I'd love to see is more of those decisions made public, so that we actually know where those gaps are, right? Like when the grievance appellate committees were set up, one thing we were kind of promised is these decisions are going to be out there. We haven't seen reports of what those decisions have been. How many times have they overturned a platform sort of decision? Have they needed to? Have they found that what people did was enough? So again, that evidence point is currently, I think, missing from conversations. And second, on the frameworks which exist outside of what you get platforms to do or what you do on platforms, right? Your traditional law enforcement mechanisms which exist in the country, which outlaw a lot of this. I don't think you can make an intentional deepfake with the intent to do harm and it not be covered by some legal provision. I'd be very surprised if there was an outlier somewhere which didn't fall under any of those requirements. But is that just having a law on paper is not obviously good enough, right? Like how do we enable those laws to be used meaningfully so that people are able to seek redressal, seek justice if they have been wronged? And that, I think, is again a big gap right now, because people don't necessarily want to come forward and go and put themselves through that process. And that's where, again, we need to come together, as Maya was saying, on finding solutions at that sort of institutional level as well, right? Like how do we fix that gap?
I think so. The answers is more about the institutional, I would say, frameworks and institutional preparedness, not just at the level of the governance, but also of the society, and how do we kind of look at them in terms of in cultural and social context also. That is also very important. So it is not just with the platforms and the government, and that's what we can say, that there are enough mechanisms as of now, but what we need more is about on the cultural and social side also, along with better and more accessible mechanisms for it in the law and in the platforms. That is what I think we can probably conclude from the discussion. Thank you so much, both of you, to take time out for this, for such an important topic. And we hope that we should have these discussions more and we see a better way out to this issue. Thank you so much.